it's time to welcome Joe on stage. Dr. Joe, can you switch the screen to your side and fire up your presentation?
That is definitely the big question. Let's see if I can get this to share. Can you see my presentation there?
Yes, I can see it very clear.
Fantastic. So thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today, Molly, and for that warm introduction. I'd just like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the many lands that we're meeting on today and pay my respect to elders both past and present. It's also good to acknowledge that the first people of Australia were some of the world's first scientists as they discovered how to use the land that they lived on and how to work with it and care for it. So there is lots of lessons to be learnt for us all there, particularly as we work to harness the natural resources of our country. So my name is Joel. I work for Iberdrola. Previously, I worked for Infigen Energy, and we were acquired by Iberdrola last year, which is a Spanish company, and they are one of the largest utilities in the world. So it's a very exciting time to be with Iberdrola and involved in renewable energy here in Australia. Just very brief, this is the, a little bit of the marketing moment of the presentation, just to introduce who Iberdrola is. So we have a fleet of renewable energy assets that we have built and others that we have contracted, about 670 megawatts, although that number is out of date as of this morning because we just announced that we're developing a new solar farm in New South Wales, a 245 megawatt solar farm. So that's very exciting today, and congrats to all the Iberdrola team on getting that off the ground. The session is to talk about risk and how we manage risk around these investments. And I will talk about more of that in a moment. But one really important thing for us is that we sell our energy to customers as our primary hedging strategy. So we have large commercial and industrial customers that we sell to. And a big part of our strategy is how do you take the variable energy from our wind and soon solar farms and firm that up to deliver the firm energy that our customers want. And so to do that, we have a fleet of firming assets. So that is gas turbines, diesel turbines that are currently turning into gas, and of course, batteries. We have a Lake Bonny battery and a new battery in New South Wales that is under construction. And so we're able to use this fleet of renewables and firming to deliver, I think, not just firm energy, but also innovative products to our customers. We're able to really work with them to shape our products, to shape the prices, and of course, to deliver green energy, which is so critically important for our and many other customers in Australia. And this is really important because while the sale of PPAs was historically a really important part of the renewable energy industry in Australia, increasingly, those PPAs are not at a price or duration that perhaps offers the maximum value. So by managing these contracts ourselves and directly those customer relationships, we're able to capture more value and have a clearer path to market, a route to market for our assets. That's really important for us. And I think increasingly, we had Infigen previously described ourselves as the utility of the future, and that is very much how Iberdrola sees it. And we don't have any interest in having large inflexible coal power stations as part of our portfolio. So I should also mention we just in terms of development assets, we are still very much in this game of developing assets. We have a combined solar wind farm under construction in South Australia. This is a really exciting project with about 270 megawatts of export capacity, and that is well underway to being developed. And of course, as I said, we have a new solar farm in New South Wales as of today, and you can see our post about that on LinkedIn if you want more details. So what I wanted to talk about today was, of course, this wind risk and investability. And one thing that we're hearing a lot, if you read the media, if you listen potentially to governments, is the NEM is not investable. So the NEM is the National Electricity Market, the main electricity market in Australia. And even the Energy Security Board, which is a body put together with the heads of the major energy regulators in the NEM, have been making some very bold claims that the NEM is no longer investable, that we have a lack of investment, particularly in firming technology, but also potentially in new renewables, that there are these barriers to investment. And I really want to explore that idea today. So to consider where we're going in the future, I think it's helpful to look at where we have been, and perhaps this will help understand why there are these concerns. So we have just come out of what we would call an investment mega cycle. And I want to kind of just step you through a little story here. So this picture here is the plot over time of the last about 20 years. And the dotted line is the underlying electricity price, the annual price for electricity in the NEM. And the solid line is the electricity price plus the green price. So this is the renewable energy target, or a renewable portfolio standard, that is tracked using these green certificates called LGCs, large scale generation certificates. And those prices there, you can see that over the last few years really shot up. And this was driven by a few really critical drivers. The first was the closure of some major coal power stations that were not forecasted in advance. 12 months before their closure, or at least their announcement, there was not even speculation by the market operator, the main forecaster, of these closures. So that caught at least some of the market by surprise. In parallel, we saw rising gas prices. We saw the cost of gas in Australia go from $2 or $3 a gigajoule to $10 to $12 a gigajoule, which had a real impact on prices. And this led to, as I said, high spot prices, but also at the same time, we have seen wind costs falling, as has happened all around the world. So the dots here are the PPA, the power purchase agreement prices that we were able to find publicly. Now, this is from a paper that Paul Simshauser and I wrote through Griffith University. And the green line there is that average price. So you can see that it came down, and really came down a lot just at the same time as wholesale prices went up. So this led to what I think you'd have to call gold rush conditions. We saw a huge glut of capacity entering the market because prices were high, costs were low. And this was not helped by this renewable energy target having a 2020 cutoff date. And we'd gone through a long period of thinking the target wouldn't be met, or the target might be cancelled. And then suddenly we had certainty, yes, the target is going ahead. And so everyone was rushing to enter. And what we saw was 105 individual projects entering the market in just 3 years. That's a lot of projects. And so it is inevitable that there were some mistakes made. Not mistakes in planning, but in hindsight. If you build 105 projects in a rush, some of them are probably not going to be as good as you thought. And so because of that, I think we've seen a lot of soul searching as to where does the fault lie? Is it with the NEM or is it with developers? And I think there has been this tendency to blame the NEM, whereas we would say, actually, any time you have a boom and bust scenario in a commodity market, you are going to see some investments which aren't ideal. So that's the kind of the lens that we're thinking about investing in the NEM through at the moment. And if I can show you just one more picture here, I think this is really powerful. This is that same story, that investment by year. And you can see in the past, we mainly invested in coal and gas in grey. And then over the last decade, it has been renewables. And that number has just shot up. And in fact, 43% of NEM investment was done in just 3 years, total dollars to date. So a lot of change. So what then? That's the past. Where are we going? What does the future hold? Well, if we're going to have long-term renewable growth, there is a lack of federal policy around climate change, emissions, and particularly around long-term renewable energy targets. So instead, state governments have been stepping in to fill that gap. We also have coal closures that are inevitable, and many of our coal power stations in Australia, which still provides 70 to 80% of our energy, our electricity, many of those coal power stations are approaching 50 years. And so they are going to fail and they are going to close, and they're probably going to do it much quicker than anyone expects. However, that's not a great way to deliver investment, because that leads to, again, those boom and bust cycles in prices, which is not great for anyone. So instead, the states have been stepping in. And I think the flagship state program at the moment is from the New South Wales government. And they've developed what is commonly called the New South Wales Roadmap, which is a target for 12 gigawatts of new renewable energy in New South Wales by 2030, which would on its own roughly double the amount of renewable energy in Australia. And then that would be coupled with 2 gigawatts of long duration storage, energy storage. And the intent of this scheme is to ensure that the replacement capacity we need for those coal closures is ready to go. New South Wales doesn't want to be left holding the bag. So this is a fantastic scheme. We very much support it. And alongside the New South Wales scheme, there is a 50% renewable energy target from Victoria and a 50% renewable energy target from Queensland. Victoria recently announced their next auction, a reverse auction for renewable energy. And Queensland has a government-owned utility, which is buying projects or PPAs and helping to develop them. So those schemes are underway and are going to be very important, but it's the New South Wales scheme that I think it's worth talking about a little bit more at the moment, because it, excuse me, it highlights some of the design choices that we have available. Also just want to mention the renewable energy zones. So this is a initiative that I think most of the state governments are pushing at the moment, which is developing new transmission to unlock new renewable resources. And this is, of course, how energy worked in the past. We would build power lines to where there was coal mines. And now we're trying to do the same thing with renewables. And I think it's a really forward-looking approach. Excuse me. So just to touch briefly on this design option around the New South Wales roadmap, the current design is to go out for the government to hold auctions, reverse auctions for CFDs, which are effectively PPAs, but with the government. The thing the New South Wales government is doing differently is to do it through swaptions, effectively options for PPAs, where they would hopefully act like a floor price. Now, this is certainly not a terrible scheme, but it does have some drawbacks. Because if the government is going out and asking you to bid, I need $60 a megawatt hour, or I need $50 a megawatt hour, it's very hard to compare different projects. So maybe you have a wind farm that is more expensive, but will deliver more valuable energy. Maybe it's more correlated with the evening. So you have a cost of $60, but will deliver $70 of value. In contrast, somebody else might have a project with a cost of $50, but only $55 of value. It's very difficult for governments to compare. And it makes it very difficult to assess the emissions abatement potential of these projects, the cost of those projects, and ultimately means that consumers are exposed to risks of up to the total amount of the PPA if those wholesale prices happen to go to zero. So this is not a terrible scheme, but we are proposing there are ways you could do this better. And that way is to leverage the same idea of this renewable energy target we have now, which is to ask projects to bid for the top up they require for new investment. So if you have your project and you think you can earn $60 in the market, but your costs are $70, you would say to the government that I need a top up of $10 a megawatt hour. Another project might say I only need a top up of $2 a megawatt hour. And it makes it a really clear way for the government to assess the good projects from the bad projects without the government having to make a their own price forecast or their own assessment of which project is going to deliver most value to consumers. It also means that now there is a really clear price value. If you use LGCs, these renewable certificates, as the currency for this top-up, we have a really clear linkage to the cost of a green project in New South Wales, and hence we can link to other abatement schemes in transport or even international offsets. So that's a very brief introduction because this is a very complex topic, but I think it's something worth getting across if you're thinking about the investment here. And just to sort of one more point on that, which is to say that there is an argument that by signing these CFDs that completely de-risk a project, or at least have the potential to de-risk a project, that will help reduce the costs. And I'm skeptical that that picture is quite as simple, because at the end of the day, you can't destroy risk. These projects ultimately still have to be sold to customers. And that means somewhere a retailer is taking on this risk. The best case outcome is that some of that risk is transferred to taxpayers. And now you're just kind of hiding it as part of the tax. So I think there's some challenges there. And it's also worth noting that there is some $10 billion worth of refinancing on debt that needs to happen in the next couple of years. So we want to really be careful about how we treat our existing projects in the market as well. And if we're just subsidizing new projects and not valuing the existing investments, then that's going to have flow on to the banks and other finance institutions. So we do need to be aware of that. So to sort of then think about the future, what are the real problems for investment in the NEM? Well, it's all of these missing markets. We are going to have a much more rapid transition than anybody expects. So we need to think about how do we deliver system strength? And this is an issue that's really quite Australian specific at the moment, but will come up in other markets inevitably. That is, how do we ensure that we can hold the grid together, that we can measure and detect faults on the network, and that the voltage is stable? So we have a shortfall of system strength in Australia, and we're only just in the process of developing a mechanism to procure that. Similarly, inertia. This is the stability of the system, the resistance to change. When something goes wrong, how long do we have to react? And we don't have any market or any way of valuing the inertia that traditionally comes from synchronous units like coal generators, but in the future might be delivered by batteries, grid-forming inverters, synchronous condensers. So we need to move very quickly to create those price signals to ensure we have what we need. We need to have timely investment in new transmission. We have traditionally lagged building new transmission lines, which means that we have curtailment and congestion. And that's led to, you can see here some data, this is a year or two old now, but there have been huge delays on a lot of the projects that were developed in the NEM due to all of these constraints I've just talked about: lack of transmission, lack of system strength, lack of just working out how do you model a grid once you get to 50, 60, 100% renewable energy. It's also, I think, important to reflect on the problems that we don't have. The first is the energy-only market in the NEM, I think, is the best possible market for the future. It values projects that deliver reliability, and it doesn't pay projects that just sit there and don't deliver. So the alternative is capacity markets, which I know is very popular in the United States and in other countries. But it's very hard to provide capacity signals that value assets correctly. How much capacity is a 2-hour battery worth? A 1-hour battery, a 4-hour battery? We don't really want a central operator to make those decisions. We, who are the utilities, the ones who actually have the renewables, actually have the customers, in our view, we're best placed to decide how valuable these assets are for us. So we should let the financial markets sort that out. And that has been an overwhelming consensus view from industry in Australia at the moment, is that the energy-only market is what is a great way to go, and the capacity markets don't really have a lot of value. There's a few exceptions to that, but they're typically large coal power stations or companies with large coal portfolios that would love to be paid for capacity that doesn't need to be flexible and doesn't need to be deliver all of the flexibility and services that we need. The other thing which I don't think is a problem is the locational signals. In the NEM, we have very strong signals through loss factors, marginal loss factors that scale your revenue. And we have signals to a very transparent market that can tell you where there is congestion in the NEM. Now, yes, there have been some projects that have been built that have not built in a good location. But remember, 105 projects in 3 years, sure. In hindsight, maybe we built too many projects in one area, or maybe we haven't built enough transmission. So my call to action is very much on the let's develop all of those missing markets and those missing services that have caused so many delays and challenges and uncertainty for investors. And then we can worry about these other problems. And of course, on top of all that, let's get a national enduring carbon scheme in place. That'll be the #1 thing that will make it easier to invest. Because if we add more renewables, we will reduce our emissions. So I'm almost out of time there. So I'm going to wrap up there and go to questions. I hope that sort of gave you a little bit of insight into the thinking that Iberdrola has at the moment around the future investing. We see there is lots of opportunities and a really great time to invest, but it is going to require sophisticated investors that can understand the complexity of the market that we operate in and make really good decisions. But I think that we're going to find that in Australia. So that's my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zhou. This is a very informative and inspiring presentation, and I really love your passionate style. Yeah. So I think as the audience needs some time to write down their questions, perhaps we can go through some of them that has been collected during the pre-registration.
Absolutely.
Give me one moment. So the first question goes to what change to regulation that are not on the table right now would assist in the growth of the wind sector. I think this question resonates with the one that is currently remaining in the open box from Daniel D. Witt. For Joe, what mechanism do you think will be the key driver for the creation of the currently missing markets in the renewable energy industry or in the NEM?
Yeah, great question. So I think a lot of it is being driven by industry at the moment. So industry is really painfully aware of where the pain points are for new investment. And so I and a couple of others from Iberdrola proposed 2 rule changes last year, one of which has been accepted, which is to develop a new fast frequency response market, a very rapid reserves market to value the reserves from batteries or demand response. In terms of the regulations that are not on the table right now, inertia seems to be the big one. We don't yet have a market for that. Reserves, how do we provide confidence to governments that there is going to be enough power to keep the lights on? And I think that's a really important question. How do we make sure there's enough reserves? And all of this, I mean, in the NEM, it's a fairly transparent process. It's around the rule changes and the framework there where anybody can propose a change to the rules that is then evaluated on its merit. So I guess to answer that, I think industry needs to drive rule changes and needs to advocate for good policy. I hope that sort of helps.
Yes.
With that.
Yes, and we see a lot of progresses that are being developed in the state government. How about the federal government?
Look, it's a good question. I saw New South Wales today just announced a 50% emissions reduction target for New South Wales by 2030, which is huge. It might not be quite enough to get to 1.5 degrees, to keep temperature 1.5 degrees, but it's a huge step in the right direction. I think the federal government, it is great to focus on technologies and the necessary technologies for the future, but ultimately we need actionable short-term targets. And the science says that we need to reduce our emissions by at least 50% by 2030 as a country. So it's absolutely critical that we develop frameworks to do that. And some form of emissions intensity scheme for the electricity sector, I think, would be really positive.
Yes, and we also got one question from the Q&A box from Andrew. Do you feel the current Supreme Court case against Fort Hill Wind Farm will have a detrimental effect on the future of companies building wind farms? I'm not very familiar with the legal aspects. Do you want to take that question?
Is this the one about noise levels and neighbours being complaining? I think that's the case. Look, I don't know the specifics of that. Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Disgruntled neighbours. Yeah, look, I don't know the specifics of that, and I sort of wouldn't want to comment there. But I think it does really highlight just how important community engagement is for development in Australia. And you can do this well, and you can do this badly. And so you need to bring that community along, make sure that everybody is getting some benefit from this project and understands the benefits to Australia. I don't think it's the end of the story for developments in Australia, but I do think that some of this work around renewable energy zones, where we're trying to get sort of projects approved, have that community buy-in ahead of time, is really helpful.
Great. I think Andrew's satisfied with that answer. And let's move on to the second question. It's about the grid issues. Do you think it's enough being done to ensure the transmission network is able to cope with the increase in renewables? I think the answer is absolutely no, but any more comments on that?
Yeah, look, again, it's always hard because we don't want to overbuild transmission because that costs money. But also, if we underbuild transmission, it means we're not going to get the least cost resources, or we're going to have congestion or delays. And my view is these risks are asymmetric. If you build a little bit too much transmission, well, yes, you've probably spent too much money now, but it'll probably be used in the future. If you don't build enough, then we're going to have much higher energy costs because we're not going to be able to build the projects that we need. And we're not going to be able to reduce emissions enough to stave off catastrophic climate change. So, but in terms of is enough being done, I think the work that the state governments are doing on renewable energy zones is really great. There's a really forward-looking approach to how do we get new transmission in. We just need to make sure that we're also keeping the flexibility to build the best projects in the best location. And there's some ideas around from the Energy Security Board, the ESB, around this congestion management model, which would effectively prevent people from building projects unless a government or the ESB thinks it's a good location. And I don't think that's a great outcome. Yes, we want to utilize renewable energy zones, but we also need to let people, take a chance on a project. And if they build a bad project, well, that's on us as investors, as long as taxpayers aren't paying for it.
Yes. And with regards to question number 4, as you mentioned, the ESB 2025 plan, will it influence any investment decisions?
Look, it's a really hard question. There is a lot of, I guess, discussion, debate going on around the ESB's plan at the moment. And there are some good things in there, and there are what I would call some not so good things. So that's still being hashed out. At the moment, I don't think there is anything likely to come out of that is going to fundamentally hurt investment, as long as the capacity market proposals don't go ahead, and there doesn't seem to be a lot of appetite there. There might be some opportunities to help investment if we're able to, drive in additional, additional flexibility. But I really think that it's the state governments that are the big influencers at the moment in terms of the future of projects.
Yes. And now the third question about future opportunities of battery storage system for wind farm projects. I believe there are some regulatory advancements with regard to encouraging wind projects incorporating battery storage projects.
Yeah, some really great stuff from the from 𝐸MO, the energy market operator, and that's been taken up by, or at least proposed by the AEMC, who makes the rules around these hybrid facilities. So some really innovative ways that you could incorporate a battery either AC coupled behind the connection point or DC coupled with your project, and have a lot of flexibility in terms of how you use and bid that battery. So I think there's some really good opportunities there. There is some potential challenges. A draft rule from the AEMC proposes charging batteries some quite significant transmission costs. And that would be, I think, very challenging for future battery investment. So definitely worth, if you're a potential investor, engaging in that process, understanding what that might mean. But you know, those DC coupled batteries, being able to reuse infrastructure, I think has a lot of potential. And we are going to need a lot of storage going out into the future. So it's a good opportunity.
It's a good news for all the battery suppliers and developers in the market, finding a chance to collaborate with Iberdrola. And now let's go to the fifth question, question number 5, Iberdrola's prospects on offshore wind and how to manage major risks in offshore wind development. Perhaps you can touch a bit on that question.
Yeah, thanks. Look, I mean, this I think is going to be very much addressed by our next speaker in a moment around the offshore opportunities. We are certainly watching the offshore space, and it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. Obviously, it's a new it's a new type of technology for Australia, at least, with some learnings for us to have here. I think at the end of the day, it's going to be the cost that is the biggest challenge. That there are a lot of good onshore wind sites, so you're going to have a really good offshore project to get across the line. So I won't say too much about where we're, you know, what we may or may not be looking at there, but it is an interesting space and one that certainly internationally is growing. So we want to make sure that we as a business stay on top of that as it matures here.
Yes, we see offshore wind as a great opportunity, and but still, I think in the next 3 to 5 years, the future will still be onshore wind as a dominant source. So I really look forward to more progress from Iberdrola and more business success from your side.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
I really